Our next speaker is Dr. Stephen Tonks. He's an associate professor in EdPsych in the Department of Leadership, Educational Psychology, and Foundations. And he's going to present an overview of his research in reading motivation and engagement in students aged 8 to 28.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you for having me. So this was the clever, that's about as clever as my titles get. Let me just check title, because it's 3:30. So over the past almost 20 years, I've worked on a number of different things, and I'm just going to highlight 4 of the projects now. I'm sharing all about my research since this is a share and, what is it, something and share? Show and share. I'm going to show and share just a few slides about each of these different projects, and I figured out that the youngest students or participants that were in any of these projects were about 8 years old in 3rd grade, and the oldest were much older, any age that a college student might be, but I thought 28 sounds like 8, so I went with that. It doesn't mean that that's what it was confined to. So these are the 4 projects that I'm going to go over. The first one is Corey, and it was an intervention project with elementary school in grades 3 to 5. Then a study called the ARM study, and I'll tell you what all these acronyms are for. Every grant project I've worked on has had an acronym that goes with it, so that's one of the first things you hear about getting grants. Come up with some acronym, even if it doesn't really make sense as a separate word. And that we looked at adolescent readers, and we defined in school, so we defined that as grades 5 to 12. And then a study that was not grant funded, but is I'm working with some people in the College of Ed on this middle school reading motivation project. And then finally, a project that I won't go into a lot of detail here. It's closely associated with CISL, the On Par project, which looks at students who are college age or in college. Okay, so the first one is called CORI, and that stands for Concept-Oriented Reading Instruction. And this project worked in elementary schools. Since this is public, I thought, okay, I'm going to put my collaborators' names on all of these. So John Guthrie and Alan Wigfield were the 2 main investigators on this project. So we worked in 5 elementary schools in one district, and this is on the East Coast. And it's before I came here, and then I was still involved in it, the project, after I came to NIU a little bit. So this was a quasi-experimental study, and we had 2 elementary schools who engaged in the CORI intervention, and I'll tell you what that is a little bit. And then we had 2 schools that did strategy instruction. This is reading instruction. And then 1 was a control school, and they just did what they normally did, but they had to take all our tests. So in the CORI intervention, the teachers developed curriculum that combined the reading time and science time. And so the topics, the concept that all the reading was oriented around was whatever they were learning in science. And often it involved ecology, and so we talked about ecological concepts and things like that. And it went on for 12 weeks, so there were 2 6-week units. Then in the strategy instruction intervention, the teachers did not do the reading and science combining, but they did do a lot of cognitive strategy instruction for reading that's appropriate for the elementary grades. The CORI, which was the concept-oriented intervention, which was the focus of the project, is based on this engagement model of reading development. One of the places you can read about that is Guthrie and Wigfield 2000. And what it does is it combines strategy instruction, which is what the field of reading instruction says you should do. Teach strategies, and they've got lots of strategies and lots of ways to teach them, and there's lots and lots of research about this. But then what we added in is specific motivation support. So in the blue ovals there are 5 specific motivation supports that the teachers deliberately worked into their instruction. So thematic units meant that it was about something about science, whatever they were studying. Real world interactions, so they did a lot of hands-on activities, maybe field trips, those kind of things to engage the students. Gave choices and supported students' autonomy. They used interesting texts, so we put a lot of work in finding trade texts for elementary school students on a number of, a range of reading levels about the science topics. And then had the students involved in collaborative activities, group work, and things like that. So the idea is that doing those things, I've just listed those because that was part of our grant. There's a bunch more things you could put over on the left that teachers can do, but that's supposed to then lead to student motivation and behavior, which is reading more, and other things, I guess, but those are the main things. And then that's supposed to lead to better comprehension, knowledge, better learning, deeper learning, those sorts of things. So we're wrapping up this first one, and this is just two little results from one of the studies that came from this. We measured motivation before the 12 weeks and after the 12 weeks, and these are just the 2 groups that had interventions. This doesn't include the control group. They were down there near the strategy instruction. So Corey group is the dark blue, and the SI is strategy instruction group. And when we measured different types of intrinsic motivations to read and reading self-efficacy, they started about the same place, and then they all grew, but the Corey group grew a little bit more. And that's hard to do. It's hard to see. First of all, sort of one theme that runs through today is it's hard to measure motivation. And the field is built on these self-reports. And trying to get those to move with any kind of intervention over any period of time is not easy. And so this was we were pretty happy that we got some movement on these self-report intrinsic motivation measures. And then this was passage comprehension, which was one of our measures of reading comprehension. They also did Gates-McGinnity, and there were some gains on that we saw as well. But on this test that we called it like a multiple texts passage comprehension test that we developed, the Corey group made better gains than the strategy instruction group. Okay, so that wraps up Corey. Next one is the ARM study, and that stands for Adaptive Reading Motivation Measures. And this project was done with collaborators at the University of Kansas and at Johns Hopkins University, and this was an IES grant that I got maybe about 9 or 10 years ago. It was a 4-year project to develop a measure, basically. So what we wanted to do is develop an online adaptive reading motivation questionnaire for students grades 5 to 12, so that could be used with all, quote, adolescent readers. We focused on reading for school. After a lot of debate about what to focus on, we're like, let's just worry about school reading because that's what teachers worry about most. This was a 4-year project. We had 3 phases where students were involved and students were taking the questionnaires. And so in the end, around 11,000 students participated. What we wanted was this computerized adaptive measure. We used a process called evidence-centered design that is this detailed and structured process for creating achievement tests. So that's what it's been for, performance, not for surveys of your beliefs and surveys of your own motivation, that kind of thing. So we adapted this process. The field is not really liking it so far. We're having a hard time getting it published because they want to see a validation study that's like all the other validation studies they've ever seen, and this one is a little different. So we're still trying to get the sort of main article that presents this published, and the grant ended 3-4 years ago. We defined 15 different reading motivation constructs. Some of those 15 are parts of intrinsic motivation to read. We had self-efficacy for reading. We had different extrinsic motivations, like reading to get a good grade, that kind of thing. And then some social motivations. This is middle school, and some of the literature we looked at also had these sort of negative motivation constructs, like self-efficacy would be how confident are you as a reader, and sort of the negative opposite would be, I think reading is way too hard, that's why I don't do it. So it's kind of really low self-efficacy, or it's even more extreme than that, but we had that as a separate construct. We also had reading avoidance, which is kind of more like a behavior, but when, high school students do that too, where they're like, I hate reading, I don't read, I'm not reading. Like whatever you want me to read, I'm just not going to do it. So we wanted to get some of these things that are a little less positive and uplifting sounding. So those are included there as well. What we ended up with after a few years of writing hundreds of items and doing a pilot test and field test and sort of getting them down to a set of items per construct is like the SAT or GRE, where you take an item, and if you get it wrong, you get an easier item. If you get it right, you keep getting harder items until they're like, okay, this is where this person is on this, ability or skill. And so that's what we did to this. So you get a self-efficacy item there's 12 in our pool, and you get one that kind of measures the middle of the scale. And if you answer a 6 out of 6, high self-efficacy, you get an item that is more extreme, that measures the high part of the scale. I'm doing this probably backwards for you. And vice, if you answer it low, you get it. So you end up getting 3 items per construct. So it's more efficient that way. So there's 15 different constructs. You end up getting 3 items per construct, so it's only 45 items. They're not too hard to answer. So then the idea was to work with teachers or schools, and then they can have their students do this, and the teacher would get a report that looks something like this. This is Sarah Davis's reading motivation scores. So over there, they're kind of standardized on a 0 to 100. Let's look for self-efficacy is right here. She got a 49 out of 100, so she's kind of in the middle on self-efficacy. And then these things are relative to other students in the class or at the school. And so she's really high in interest in reading. So she's got high interest, higher than 84% of the students. So we were trying to get something that, like a score report, that would be useful for teachers. We're still struggling to figure out what to do with this thing. We've got it. It's kind of it was built in an old language that is really hard to get out there and on the web and all these other things. So we're trying to figure out what the next step still is with this and what we want to do with it. Okay, that wraps up that one. Our next is middle school reading motivation. I'm working with Kelly Summers and David Walker, who are in the College of Education with me. This one is it's a larger project, but sort of my part of it is trying to look at self-determination theory, which is a theory of human motivation, and trying to measure reading motivation within the framework of self-determination theory. So 2 things you might measure are autonomous motivation to read, and then controlled motivation. So autonomous motivation is a lot like what the rest of the field thinks of as intrinsic motivation. And then controlled is extrinsic. So autonomous feels internal, volitional, I'm deciding to do it. And then controlled motivation is somebody's making me do it, or I have to do it for a deadline or something like that. And so measuring these 2 with the idea that in the future can use a measure like this to work with small interventions for supporting autonomy. So if the teachers want to do autonomy supportive reading instruction, then we can measure how autonomously motivated the students are to read before and after such an intervention. So we're trying to develop an autonomous reading motivation scale. We used a sample from a district near here, a large, diverse district with we got about 700 middle school students to fill it out. And we're at the point where we've got a scale. Now we need to do, we have a few variables that we can relate them to, but those are scale variables, but we need to administer it again with a number of things to do a better validation study. So what they see on the scale is a prompt that says, why do you read for school? So the last one we were just looking at school reading, and this one we wanted to look at academic reading or school reading, and also free time or recreational reading. So they get a prompt, why do you read for school? Then they get a bunch of different items. An autonomous item might be because I enjoy reading, and they rate that on 1 to 6. Or because I think reading is fascinating. And then you can get their autonomous academic reading score from that. A controlled academic item might be because others will reward me if I read, or so that I won't have to do it later. And so those are two of the scales. Then we've got autonomous recreational and controlled recreational. Again, autonomous would be something like because I like to. They would get the prompt, why do you read in your free time? And they would say, because I like to, 1 to 6, because I think reading is interesting. And then recreational would be the similar items as the controlled academic, and it'd be because others expect me to read or because my teacher tells me to. Sometimes teachers encourage their students to read in their free time or something. So that's where we are with that. I just presented this at AERA, and then I'm going to present it at a conference for self-determination theory researchers next month. We're doing a few more analyses before that. Okay, and finally, the OnPar project. So it's me and then a bunch of people from psychology at NIU. So Joe Magliano is the PI on this. Chris Parker, when he was around, he was working with us, and now Alicia Santuzzi is working with us. And a number of grad students, I know a few of you at least in the audience, have done different things for this project, especially helping with data collection or data analysis. So the overall goal of the project is to develop and refine a model of proficient academic reading, that's the PAR, the proficient academic reading. And now that we're trying to publish on this, we're not calling it OnPar anymore, because the reviewers are like, what's the on? Why OnPar? Because it's catchy, right? That's the only reason. And so now we've just started calling it PAR, which is kind of boring, but that's okay. It's no worse than ARM. So then it's for college students, but then a focus on developmental education students. 4-year grant-funded project, and we're near the end of the grant funding, but lots of data to publish on if we keep going with it. So I just wanted to mention a specific motivation-related goal that I'm working on. Well, the team is working on, but I'm sort of got a bigger role in that. And it's to better understand and measure general and situational reading motivation. So, that's the whole OnPar model. So this is what we sent to the funding agency in the proposal, and so here's the motivation piece down here. It's got foundational skills, metacognition, and then leading or predicting academic literacy skills. Okay, so then my main part is the motivation part down here, and so reading motivation being RM, general reading motivation versus situational reading motivation. And it's the versus just implies we're trying to figure out if one is better than the other. But what we really want to know is if one adds to the other. And specifically, general is what the field and what the motivation field in general, how they measure motivation. These self-report things. I feel confident when I have to read for school. So it's just very general about anything you might read for school. Or I like to read about new things. Okay, so that's very general. Yeah, but we all have different interests. You know, I like to read about new things about this, but definitely not about this. I would never read anything about this. So that's how motivation and reading motivation specifically has been measured. Hard to predict things, hard to relate to outcome variables, hard to relate to performance and test scores and things that people want to see. So with this project, it's allowed us to also look at situational reading motivation and try to create a measure to see, so we can still ask them these things, and then they do these situational reading tasks, and then we ask them about that activity or that reading they just did. It's kind of like Csikszentmihalyi's experiential sampling. You're not really right in the middle of something, but you just did something. Now tell us about your confidence or self-efficacy on that thing, or tell us about your interest in that, or how much you enjoyed that thing you just did right now. And we're trying to see if measuring it this way is better than measuring it this way, or or both of them together more predictive of outcomes, or does this add, or do they interact, that kind of thing, or does this mediate the general reading motivation going into the outcome being something like reading comprehension. So the question is just talking more about interventions for students who are extrinsically motivated, right?
Yeah.
Motivating students is a huge problem, so are there interventions that address that, especially specific to reading? There are lots, and what the belief is that intrinsic motivation is always better because it leads to deeper learning and retention and just better learning. Whereas extrinsic motivation is powerful and just as maybe stronger, just as strong, if not stronger, motivator to get people to do things. But if you're only extrinsically motivated or have controlled motivation to learn, then you can memorize for a test, but then you're not going to retain the knowledge. It's going to be surface level sort of learning. And so any interventions that researchers develop are always to encourage intrinsic or autonomous motivation. Even within the field of motivation research, there's a lot of criticism that all we do is develop measures and do correlational studies, and we get it. We know about people's motivations now, like let's do something about it. And there's that criticism, but then there's another set of people who are like, we're doing it. We are doing these things. There's a lot of research out there, not as much as some people want. And as you all know, as researchers, it's much harder to get into schools and do a big intervention study than it is to do a one-off or even a 2 or 3 surveys, a longitudinal. That's even easier than getting in and doing interventions. And then you did all this work and your intervention didn't bring anything, and now you can't publish it because you didn't get any growth in motivation. That said, there is a lot going on, and there's a lot of good suggestions and a lot of stuff to read about how teachers can encourage better kinds or intrinsic motivation. And I'm happy to show you some of those. But there has been, over the last 10 years, I'd say, more focus on intervention work. So the question is, what are some causes?
It seems like there's
why is motivation a problem?
Intrinsic, extrinsic.
I think
why does everyone not just love to read? Why, you know what I mean? Like, what are
that's it. I think talk to any teacher and they could come up with a different reason, like 5 different reasons per class. Like, go ahead, Lindsay. Lindsay and LeBoy are both former high school teachers, or current, I guess. But
just from because I study more the cognitive side of reading, and we see again and again that small discrepancies in ability at the beginning turn into huge discrepancies down the road. And I think even like slight differences between you and the people around you in basic proficiency at the outset can be very demotivating.
Okay.
Which ends up
That's what I
amplifying
wondered,
the
if it's an
initial
ability,
difference.
if ability feeds motivation, or if,
Oh, yeah.
you know what I mean? Like, or is it
It's
circular?
both.
Like, I'm
It's,
both.
yeah, it's definitely both. And that, so I feel like it's almost easier to explain like an extreme case like that. It's like, oh, clear learned helplessness. Look at this. They've gotten, no encouragement and all this, and they've just gone down and down. But then what about like the good students? Like my 9th grader, he does pretty well in school. He does not read at all anymore for pleasure. Even though I'm like, hey, maybe, put down the video for a little bit and maybe read a book. And I think it's like always assessing the effort. It's like a little harder, and I just don't feel like it. There's so many, we could go on forever.